Welcome to Chapter and Verse. With us today, a special new guest, Professor Eric Hirsch. And we're going to talk about a program, we're going to talk about an item in the news, which is almost always in the news, having to do with homelessness and affordable housing. For some people, they don't even have money for rent.
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of people think about characteristics of homeless people as if something like mental illness or drug use or other individual factors like that are important.
I've heard people talk like that.
But there are a lot of people with mental illness who have an apartment.
Yes.
There are a lot of people who use drugs who have apartments or alcohol. The one thing that ties all people who are homeless together is they don't have enough money to pay the rent. So very, very low income. About half of the people who show up at our shelters have no income at all. And then another 20 to 30% are on what's called supplemental security income or social security disability income, which is what we give people when they're completely disabled and can't work. But guess how much we pay them? It's $10,000 a year, which won't even
$10,000 a year.
It won't even get you an apartment.
Yes.
And the overwhelming majority of people on disability do not get housing, as part of that. So
how do people make it through?
So generally what people do is we use the phrase double up.
Oh, yes.
So they double up with friends, they double up with family, but then something might happen, like maybe it's really overcrowded, or maybe a pandemic like COVID hits and you can't be in a crowded situation.
Yes.
So people get evicted from the doubled up situation, and that's when people generally wind up on the street. When they have no income or very limited income, and they can't double up with friends or family any longer.
I heard a new study out within the last couple of days, 3 days, and it said that the average American, 83% of Americans, are afraid to be in public because of the element of violence. They think that it could happen to them, and they're aware of that. Crime is a big issue.
Yes, and mass shootings certainly in the news recently.
Right.
I mean, there are things we could do about that, but so far, National Rifle Association is so politically powerful that we haven't done them, even though the majority of people are not only scared of potentially being shot.
Yes.
They also agree that we should ban assault weapons, that we should have red flag warnings for people who shouldn't have guns. So there are a lot of things we could do, but so far hasn't been politically feasible to do them.
There have been assassins in the news who choose homeless people.
Yes. Yes, people, they talk about homeless people as if they're dangerous.
Yes.
But what's really the danger is that homeless people are targeted by others who are blaming them for the fact that they can't pay the rent and that the apartment rents are too high for them. But people get blamed, and then they're stigmatized, and then they become targeted, sometimes killed. Women who are outside do their best to hide because a lot of times they're sexually assaulted or attacked like men are.
Yes.
So that's the danger, not that homeless people will be doing something to others, but that they will be assaulted on the street because they're being blamed for their situation.
I remember listening to a lecturer at one time, and she surprised me greatly. She said she was going up to the legislature, and she made a pitch to the legislature, which I think would have been a winning pitch. She basically said, we're spending a lot of money on social services. And she said, if we just get the people a house or an apartment, we wouldn't have to spend all that money on the social services of finding them a place temporarily. And she said it is less expensive to get people an apartment than it is expensive to pay the social services.
Exactly, and that's especially Medicaid. So Medicaid, of course, is the insurance program for people with very low income, paid for half by the federal government and half by the states.
Yes, yes.
And if you leave people on the street, a lot of times they will be using drugs or they'll be using alcohol. Many times to deal with, what being on the street is like. It's horrible. And so you're drinking because of that. Then these people are picked up on the street, taken to an emergency room. So that's the ambulance run, the emergency room expenses. Sometimes then they're admitted to a hospital. After that, they're sometimes discharged to nursing homes or assisted living, all of which is paid for by Medicaid. So absolutely, we have studies, some of them my own studies, that show that particularly for the people who use Medicaid at the highest rate, it absolutely is cheaper to put them in an apartment where they might be able to deal with the underlying issues more effectively. If you're on the street, you can't really deal with much of anything except trying to figure out where you're going to be that night so that you don't die. Obviously in the winter. And we have had people die. We had people die this winter because they were sleeping on a park bench, for example. So, and somehow that doesn't even get publicized.
No, I have never seen anything like that in the media.
Think about the resources that we have as a society, how much money we spend on so many things, but we can't seem to get everyone a roof over their head. Right now we have between 350 and 400 people living outside. They were there for the winter too. This is a shifting group of people. It's not all the same people. But we know that there are hundreds of people living outside. That's just not acceptable in a society with the kind of resources we have.
Yes.
But we continue to allow it to happen.
How much money do we have so that we can dedicate that money to the problem?
We have, the federal government sends us about $12 million a year to deal with homelessness. The state chips in maybe half that. And so there's a lot of money devoted to it. But the big problem we have right now is that our system of solving the problem depends on private landlords. So someone will get a voucher, a rental voucher. And then they have to go around to these private landlords and say, will you accept this voucher? Well, given that rents are going up so quickly, given that you have to undergo an inspection, given that there's paperwork to complete, why would the landlord agree to accept someone? So they don't. And a lot of times people wind up having to turn that rental voucher back in because they can't find a landlord to accept it. So what we need construction with public subsidies to make sure that when we have money and people have rental vouchers, that they can use them, that there's a place for them to go. That's the biggest problem we've had, I would say, over the last 10 years.
Paying the rent.
Paying the rent, absolutely, but even when the government is willing to pay the rent, and allow someone to pay 30% of their income. So let's say you're on SSI, you're on this supplemental security income, you're disabled.
Yeah.
You're getting $800 a month. That's, first of all, a joke. That no one can live on that.
Right.
But you could pay maybe $200 of that a month for your rent. Well, you can't get that in the private market, obviously.
Right.
It's never going to happen. And then you can't find a landlord willing to accept it, even when you have the voucher that allows you to pay that $200, and the state or federal government picks up the rest of that rent.
So, is that a free enterprise problem?
It's a free enterprise problem. So, markets are definitely good for certain things, like to figure out what food prices should be. Supply and demand is a good process for figuring that out. Obviously, unfortunately, food prices have been going up a lot.
Yes.
And people can't afford that either. But with regard to housing, the market only serves people who are pretty well off right now. Because I always challenge people when I talk about homelessness, show me a low income or even middle income house or apartment that was built purely by the private sector sometime in the last 50 years.
Wow.
No one can come up with it. We don't build really low income and middle income housing. You know, it has to be a public subsidy. In fact, we count low and moderate income housing in Rhode Island by the number of subsidized by the government housing units there are, because we know the private sector isn't building any of that. I don't blame them. It's more profitable to build for higher income people, so that's what they do. And so it's market failure. That's the problem we have, that the market is not providing for the lower income people. And I would say it's about half of all households in the state. It's not just people on SSI. It's people making $40,000 a year. Let's say you make $40,000 a year, well over what you'd make if you made the minimum wage. There's nothing you can even rent, much less get a single family home. But no one seems to think about it this way. When people think of homelessness, they think of someone who's drunk, or someone who's using drugs, or someone who's mentally ill. But what about the supply side? Forget about the demand side completely.
Yes.
Don't think about the people or households who are going to move into the housing. Just think about the supply, what's available. The rents are $2,000 a month for a 2-bedroom apartment that's available. So you need to make around $65,000 a year, at least, to be able to afford that. So what are we supposed to do? What are the people supposed to do who don't make that much money? It's amazing that we don't have more homeless people than we do have because of the failure of the housing market to provide housing.
That's interesting. And yet there are, I guess, a lot of young people today, not just young people, I'll bet, but there are a lot of young people today who say, capitalism has failed us. Let's try socialism. Mm-hmm. And yet the videos that we see of Moscow, for example, have empty shelves that go on endlessly.
Right.
No food at all, even if they had a little money,
Right.
and I don't know if they do. But even if they don't or do, it doesn't seem to matter. The shelves are empty.
So let me just address that. So the idea of the early Soviet Union centralized planning of the economy, that didn't work.
No.
It absolutely didn't work.
No.
They had, different quotas for people. There was one cartoon, I don't know if it came out in the Soviet Union or not. And what it was, a giant warehouse.
Yes.
And then rolling out of the giant warehouse was this 100-ton nail.
Yeah.
So the point was, the way the quota worked, you had to have 100 tons of nails. But the quota didn't specify whether you could actually sell the nails, right? It's 100-ton nail. That's to portray the inefficiency of central planning.
Oh, yes.
So it doesn't work for something like that.
Yeah.
But let's look at Europe. European countries, they have a private sector with regard to housing, and then they have a public sector. Often 40% of housing is provided by the government, because they know, like we should know but don't, that the private sector alone is not going to provide housing for, in many cases, half of the households. So that's the situation we're in. We need a mix. I wouldn't say let's have a totally centrally planned economy. We know it doesn't work.
Yeah.
But we absolutely need government intervention in the
Yes.
housing market. And I have not heard the argument against that. Anyone who knows about housing markets realizes there has to be really important government subsidies, or we're going to wind up with a lot of people without any housing, and that's what we have now.
There was an interesting, although it probably won't solve the whole problem. Years ago, there was the late Senator Jack Kemp, and he was in charge of HUD for a while.
Yes.
And he had an idea.
Department of Housing and Urban Development. In
Yes.
case people don't know what that is.
Yes. And he was known as the bleeding heart conservative. He is in charge of a lot of houses, low-income houses, places where the government, I think, may have owned the places.
Right, right.
And he turned around and he said, why don't we give the apartments, the housing, to the poor? Just give it to them. Now, they have to keep it up,
Right.
which may not be the easiest thing in the world either. But they have to keep it up. And he just gave the property to them.
I mean, I think in this particular country, in the United States, it makes sense to require people to pay some percentage of their income.
Yes.
So like I said, even people who are on SSI making $800 a month, if we put them into publicly subsidized housing, they're required to pay $200, $230 a month for their rent.
Yeah.
And I think the idea there is then people have an investment in making sure they keep up the property, and I think I'm perfectly happy with that. I don't think we can just give away housing. Maybe they could do that in other countries, but I don't think they can do that in this country.
In the news lately, there's been, I think it had to do with the Daily News of February 27th, where the article said that formerly homeless Bronx family faces eviction in this case, and the advocates say that highlights the need for good cause tenant protections. When they say good cause tenant protections, what's being said?
Yeah, so I think it's Just Cause. That's the name of the
Just Cause.
Just Cause.
Yeah.
And the idea there is that landlords shouldn't be allowed to evict people for whatever random reason they want. That there has to be just cause. There has to be a good reason. You know, so non-payment of rent would be the obvious one.
Yes.
But a lot of times landlords just want to get rid of people so that they can jack up the rents.
Yeah.
And that's what's been happening lately. So people get evicted. Those are the people who wind up homeless and wind up outside.
They just couldn't keep up with the
Exactly.
Requirements.
And COVID-19, the pandemic, was probably the worst crisis in terms of homelessness in Rhode Island that we've seen. And I've been following this and trying to end homelessness in the state since I got here. Used to live in New York, so in 1990. And that's really right around the time when homelessness started to get bad. But the worst situation I've ever seen in those 30 plus years is right now. And that's because when COVID-19 hit, a lot of things happened. People couldn't double up with friends or family because they couldn't be in a crowded situation. We had to reduce the number of people in the shelters so that people weren't crowded and so that they wouldn't get sick.
Yes.
People lost their jobs and so couldn't pay their rent. So when you put all of that together, for the first time really in the state's history, at least recent history, we had many people living outside year-round. And that's been the case over the last 2 to 3 years.
That's really frightening.
So we had up to 500 to 600 people living outside in the last
That sounds
couple of
deadly.
years. We have, like I said, we have lost people outside because you need a roof over your head. It's New England. You know, maybe there's climate change, but it still gets cold. That one night when it went below zero and the state had just opened the Armory on Cranston Street in Providence, the windows blew out and the temperature went down to 30 degrees in that shelter where 200 people were staying, and the state really had to scramble to try to find places for people to go. We have a similar situation because at the end of this month, at the end of April, the Armory is closing down, and we are going to lose 200 beds. They're pretty much all cots in that facility, and those people don't have anywhere to go. The state is still scrambling to try to find buildings or places where those people can go.
Do you have, in your imagination and in your survey of the situation, is there something on the horizon which seems that it might help?
I mean, I think one thing that would help would be to have the state of Rhode Island really intervene in the housing market and put public money into housing development.
Yes.
And I think there are several bills at the State House right now that's the proposal, to create state funding, ongoing state funding for housing development. And that would probably be mixed income housing. It's not like the old public housing with these giant high rises and everybody's living in poverty. We don't do that anymore. We do low rise, we do mixed income, and these kind of developments actually increase property values in the neighborhoods where they're typically built.
That's important to know.
Right, that's another myth, that anytime you do housing development, it's going to reduce property values.
It causes people to be scared of the new neighbors.
Right, and one of the other really big issues we have is this idea of not in my backyard.
Oh yes.
And this is the way people always phrase this. They say, well, I really think homelessness is bad, and I really believe we should do something about it. And then the but is coming, but not in this neighborhood. And there's a whole variety of potential reasons why they don't want it in their neighborhood.
Like what?
They'll say there's not enough transportation. We've been seeing in South Providence, people are saying, well, we already have enough of that kind of thing here, and so we shouldn't have any more. It'll increase the number of kids that'll be in school, and so that'll increase our property taxes. But the point I always make is, if everyone says this is the wrong place, then we won't be able to build any housing, or we won't be able to find any places to shelter people either. So people have to try to understand the situation, listen to the people who are homeless or have been homeless. They're human beings just like you. They're your neighbors. They're your relatives. I think a lot of the problem is the stigma that people face once they're homeless. And again, that comes from saying that they're responsible for their situation rather than the housing market, when the housing market is what's truly responsible for the situation. And I've done a lot of life histories of people who've been homeless. And in every single case, without exception, it was a series of misfortunes that the person faced. Not just one thing, but a series of bad luck, essentially.
Yeah.
I'll just give one example. So this friend of mine who became friends once he became an advocate on the issue of homelessness. He was an ambulance driver. He was an emergency medical technician.
Yeah.
He was driving to Newport Hospital.
Yeah.
And a drunk driver crossed the center line and hit him head on at a very high rate of speed. His patient, went from the back of the ambulance all the way to the front and luckily hit some pillows and wasn't injured at all. But he nearly lost his foot and had severe spinal injuries. So guess what? Then he couldn't drive an ambulance. He couldn't be an EMT. He lost that job. He was seriously disabled, really. He became like a computer whiz
Yeah.
and got a really good job with a computer company, like I don't know if it was IBM or who it was, Intel I think it might have been. And then the dot-com bubble burst and he lost that job. He was alienated from his family because he had talked about his father who was an alcoholic and was seriously abusive.
Oh.
And his siblings didn't want to deal with that, kicked him out of the house, and then he became homeless. He was living in his car. This is typical, okay? Living in his car, didn't have any money. His car broke down, so he couldn't get it fixed. Then it was towed because it was illegally parked because he couldn't get it fixed. And he wound up at Crossroads with literally only the shirt on his back. None of his personal possessions. That all went with the car. You can't get into your car unless you can have the money to get it out of the lot. And he was completely homeless. So that just gives you some idea of the stories that are out there. Every single person who's experiencing homelessness or who has a story like that. But people don't think about that. They think, oh, these homeless people, they're all X or they're all Y. And it's all about blaming the victim of our inadequate housing market.
Yeah. I've just been told kind of an unhappy thing. We're running out of time.
Okay.
I know we could do more on our conversation. I have hardly even scratched my notes.
I'd be happy to come back and we can continue this.
We can do that.
Yes.
I'd like that too. I want to thank you and Josephine. She recommended you to us.
Well, I'm happy that she did. I'm happy to talk to you about this.
Yes. Well, is there anything you'd like to say in the minute and a half we have left?
I would say I would ask people to contact their legislators in the General Assembly, contact the governor. His number is 222-2080.
Yeah.
You'll get a machine and you can record. Ask him to do something about the hundreds of people who are living outside, to make sure that they have shelter beds and that they have a path to get into permanent housing. That's really all we're asking the state to do.
A path to get into permanent housing.
Like an apartment.
Yes. And the first thing you mentioned?
Right now, let's get people with a roof over their head. So get them into shelter first. Get them out of just being out on the street and into a shelter bed. And then, once they're in shelter, make sure we have a way to get them into permanent housing. Everyone deserves a home. And the state has the resources, particularly with all the money they got from COVID, from the federal government, to make that happen.
Would it also help to contact our local senator, our local representative, if we can find out who it is?
Like city council or that kind of?
No, state.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So yeah, you can find that out online and contact them also, because we absolutely need them to pass laws that help, bills that would help end homelessness.
Yes. Okay, well, we'll try to find out where they can go. They can call the local library, the reference librarian, and tell them our address and say who was our state senator, who was our state representative, and leave the pretty much the same message.
The Secretary of State's website will tell you who your rep your rep is and your senator is, and you can get their phone numbers.
Well, we're out of time. It's so nice to see you for the first time. Looking forward to seeing you again.
Thanks, Ray. I enjoyed it.
Thanks.